Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and we are very delighted to be hosting historian Jay Winik, who's here to talk about his new book, 1861, The Lost Peace. In the more than 3 decades that Jay has been turning out history books, he's had a tendency, you may have noticed, to structure them around pivotal periods. That's certainly what he did in his previous work on the Civil War, April 1865, when he focused on the conflict's final days. That was 24 years ago. Now, with his new book, he looks at how the war began, or more precisely, how it might have been avoided. As a Wall Street Journal review of the book observed approvingly, Jay, quote, has lost none of his narrative verve, ear for dialogue, eye for the unexpected detail, and willingness to stir some controversy. Plus, the review added, what could be more timely in 2025 than a book about American anger overflowing? While Abraham Lincoln, of course, plays an important part in this story, Jay presents a wider cast of characters and weaving together evocative profiles of other influential figures and their drift towards extremism. He recaps the ratcheting tensions over slavery that led to Southern secession, from the bleeding Kansas violence of the 1850s to John Brown's 1859 raid on Harper's Ferry. But at the heart of his book are detailed accounts of 2 effortful 11th-hour attempts to forestall war, the Crittenden Compromise and the Washington Peace Conference. The Crittenden Compromise was a set of constitutional amendments introduced by Kentucky Senator JJ Crittenden, called by Jay one of history's unsung figures. The proposal would have ensured slavery in the South, prohibited in the North, and to the West effectively restored the Missouri line from the Compromise of 1820. But the plan was opposed by Lincoln and ultimately rejected. As for the Washington Peace Conference, which is held in February 1861 at the Willard Hotel in hopes of preventing the secession of more slave states after 7 already had left, compromise there too was elusive, but Jay captures the intensity, drama, and suspense of the deliberations. Publishers Weekly called Jay's book a vivid, tragic narrative of a nation coming to pieces. And it is indeed a very compelling and illuminating read. In conversation with Jay will be Evan Thomas, no slouch of an author himself. Evan's written 13, is it 13 out now? 13 books, who's counting? 13 books of biography and history, the most recent, Road to Surrender, about the decision to use nuclear bombs against Japan, and he's working on another one about the World War II involving the Germans. He also had a distinguished career as a journalist, which included nearly a decade with Time magazine, followed by more than 20 years reporting and editing for Newsweek. He also has taught writing and journalism at Harvard and Princeton, and we appreciate him here at P&P for how often he agrees to moderate events. He's a friend of Jay's and wrote the foreword to 1861, saying this: it is impossible to know how our own tortured age will play out, whether democracy will survive and the anger that divides us will somehow abate, but it is fascinating and instructive to go back in the skilled hands of Jay Winik to a similarly chaotic time before the fall when the peace was lost. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Jay Winik and Evan Thomas.
Is Politics and Prose the greatest bookstore that there is? Yes. Thank you, Brad. Great to be here with Jay and his wife, Evie. And let's just start off by asking Jay, so how did this book happen? How did it come to pass?
Well, it came to pass because after my last book, I had to have a new book to write. And so I sort of fished around, looked at different topics. And then eventually I sort of hit upon this idea which is a model of my April 1865. For those of you who aren't familiar with that book, they would see that I wrote about how America almost came apart because of guerrilla warfare, because of tensions that still simmered. And it was a very perilous moment, and the nation nearly came apart at the end of the war. But having become skilled at writing about the ends of war, as I looked around, I realized that the question of why the war begins in the Civil War is perhaps the most important question this nation has ever faced. And having said that, I thought this was the book I should write. I mean, it's a debate that hasn't been had enough, but we're going to have it here.
Well, do a little scene setting for us, Jay. You're a vivid scene setter, and you talk to us about Senator Seward and the cane. Not Seward, excuse me, Senator Sumner and the cane.
Well, Seward and Sumner. Sumner was one of the great senators in America at the time. He was from New York. He was highly educated. When he got to a doorway with a young lady sort of entering in, he would say in Latin, "Oh, this is yours, my dear." And he was really a force to be reckoned with. And one day he was in the well of the Senate, and he was writing notes. And those notes actually were franking. He was writing to his constituents. And everything was quiet and peaceful. And then all of a sudden, there was a pitter-patter of slow steps. And it was a congressman from the South and his cousin. And all of a sudden you heard, boom! He got struck with a cane. And then Sumner got hit time and time and time and time. And he was bleeding and he was whimpering, and finally he only escaped by wrenching his desk out of the floor. But he was in terribly bad shape. And what this showed is that the tensions were deep, almost immutable, and were going to be hard to quell. And to give you a sense of the passions, poor Sumner, he got reams of presents sent to him every day. And these presents were canes. And the Southerners were saying, "This is what we think of you, sir." And of course they would have dueled him, but they didn't think he was an equal, so he did not merit a duel. So that's Sumner. And the other senator who was really one of the central figures of the drama of the Civil War in different array of parts was
Well, let's get to Seward later. Let's do John Brown here. He's the other half of this puzzle of the setup.
okay, the other half of this puzzle is John Brown. And John Brown was somebody who failed in everything he had done in his life. He had 12 wives. Every business went bad. He was just an utter rank failure. And most people thought he looked like a kind of ancient prophet. But his goal was to raise an army. He was an abolitionist. He, with every fiber of his body, wanted to get rid of slavery. And he raised an army, but it was an army that was not 150 or 1,000 men as he hoped and thought, but it was just like 15 men. But these 15 men were willing to sort of give their lives for this cause, and one night they went out and they shot some people who were slave owners. But the first person they shot was actually a slave himself. So that was an auspicious beginning. And so they were in Harper's Ferry, and they carried out this strategy to intimidate the North. And the North was actually, they were so worried about this that as their train went through Harper's Ferry, they were throwing out notes saying, "We have been surrounded by an army of 1,000 men. Please send help and send it fast." And so a man was tracked down to put down this insurrection, and it was none other than Robert E. Lee. And Robert E. Lee, as you know, was given the head of the leadership of the Northern Army, and that's one of history's quirks. Here,
Was offered it. Was offered
he
it.
was offered it, and he was offered it by two people. One was by Winfield Scott, and the other was by Lincoln himself. But so the fate of John Brown, he was written off as a crazy man at the time, but he evidently impressed his jailers as he was taken to be hung. He filed out of the jail, and his jailers were giving them personal effects, and they were asking for his signature. And it was very moving. And then all of a sudden, you heard these steps going up a stairs, and it was Brown about to be hung. And then in the hills, they were dotted by people watching to see this piece of history play out. And so a sack was put over his head. There was all of a sudden a silence. Everyone paused for what would happen next. And then a trapdoor opened, and he was hanging in space. And it took something like 10 minutes for him to die. It was a very moving scene, and eventually he was dead. But though he was dead, his spirit of anti-abolitionism, of anti-slavery, was as powerful as ever. Intellectuals all throughout the North, they all sort of put their hat with his hat, and this was one of the sparks that lit the Civil War.
I mean, it's funny to think just he had his army was about 12 people, and
12
yet it had
people.
this incredible inflammatory effect all through the South, especially that they believed that he was going to raise 100,000 people,
Right.
including a slave army. This is the inflamed world that Lincoln enters when he's elected, and before he comes to Washington. 7 states actually succeed, but does Lincoln think that civil war is inevitable?
Yeah, this is interesting if you think about it. Most of us take it for granted that Lincoln thought civil war was inevitable. But in fact, he repeatedly said when he went from Illinois on this long winding trip to Washington, D.C., he just said time and time again in speeches. People would say, "We want a speech. We want a statement. We want something telling us where you stand." And in private, Lincoln would often say that there is no real hatred between the two of us. They can keep their small number of slaves in the territories. They can keep their slaves in the North, but it will eventually sort of die away on the vine of its own internal logic. And he did not think or believe or want a great conflagration. But what happened is that he eventually, by his own policies, we don't think of this, but he decided whether or not there would be a great war.
So key to this is what's going on, and let's talk before that. Let's talk about his trip to Washington. When he arrives in Washington, how does he get there? What's that train trip like? Who's after him?
Well, he brought Pinkerton, the legendary detective, with him because he was afraid he was going to be assassinated. or he was told he was going to be assassinated. So Mary, his wife, and his daughter were put on one train that chugged its way into Washington, D.C., and Lincoln was put on a different train, his train, and he was wearing a Cossack hat. And what else did Ossie say in terms of his?
He had an old felt hat. I mean, he wasn't thoroughly disguised, but they were seriously worried he was going to get killed by the plug. I love this, the Plug Uglies, who are I guess a vigilante band that was a serious threat to kill him. He had to sneak in the middle of the night.
Yeah,
Disguised.
and at one point, he sort of gets off the train, and he looks into this silhouette of darkness, and he thought, an assassin, someone there to kill him, and it turned out that it was simply Pinkerton himself. But the tensions were very high, and frankly, in the outer regions of Washington, D.C., sort of that in that direction, there were riots by Lincoln's own militia, and they said, we will never allow that man to become president, not that black Republican.
So he gets to Washington, and there's a peace conference going on. It's not too late. Tell us about the peace conference.
Well, this is one of the great finds in history and one of the unexplored incidents that happened, but is central to understanding the Civil War and how the Civil War broke out and why it broke out. But there was a great debate taking place at the Willard Hotel in what was called the Great Peace Conference. And there were people from Virginia, from New York, from North, from South. They were from all different parts of the country. And they believed that peace could be maintained and peace could be won and kept. But one thing that they couldn't determine was how to get Lincoln to sign off on this. And actually, at one point, Lincoln came to this peace conference, whose debates were of such quality and interest, and that they rivaled the founding fathers in what they talked about and what they rendered. But Lincoln came by, and at the time, Lincoln was then not the Lincoln we see today. He was regarded as a baboon, as a hick, as somebody not worthy of this great station of being president. But he made his way, and he talked to all the different senators and governors, and there were a few ex-presidents as part of the conference. And he charmed almost everyone he came into touch with. They decided at the end that this is a man to be reckoned with. Now, another really fantastic detail from the peace conference at the Willard Hotel is that one night the delegates, the senior delegates, went across the street and they went to the White House. And there they found Buchanan, and he looked tired and worn and weary.
President Buchanan.
Yeah, President Buchanan. And he was disheveled, but he put his arm around one of them, and he said, my God, I hope you succeed. You have to do this for our children and our children's children. So there are great hopes put on this conference, but they just couldn't get it over the
So there are 7 states have succeeded. Tell us about Jefferson Davis and how he felt about all this.
Well, Jefferson Davis became the president of the Confederacy, and he was also a very senior member of the Congress when he was a part of the Union, and it's very powerful and poignant. Davis leaves. He puts in his resignation in the well of the Congress. He's joined by 4 other Confederates, and they're walking down the aisle, and they're shaking hands with all their former comrades who were in the Union. And then that night, Varina Davis, who was Jefferson Davis's wife, she heard weeping. So she was in a darkened living room, and this weeping was coming from a darkened dining room, and she went in to see what was happening. And what was happening was, it was Davis crying because he knew that there was an Armageddon to come if they couldn't get peace at the peace conference.
So there is a peace conference. They're not quite getting it done. They don't have Lincoln on board. Tell us about Crittenden.
Well, Crittenden, who I call one of the unsung heroes of the Civil War, was everything in American political life except for being president. He was vice president, he was secretary of war, and on and on and on and on. But the one thing he wanted most of all was to be the peacemaker, was to keep the peace. And he was a consummate moderate, and he was from Kentucky. He liked bourbon, he liked fast women, and he liked fast horses. He was quite a figure. And he was substantive enough that in one debate in the Congress, Lincoln himself actually came and watched Crittenden debate. So they held a number of meetings and committee meetings. But when they took the votes, they were always, it seemed, 1 or 2 votes short.
They're close, but they're not there. Meanwhile, in Charleston Harbor, tell us about Major Anderson and what's happening down there.
You see, this story is just rich with great individuals in history who affected history. And what happened is as the North and South were drifting along into war, Major Anderson, he commanded a small little number of men. They were on a spit of a land, Fort Moultrie. And then on his own, he decides they're going to go to Fort Sumter. And once they go to Fort Sumter, they basically drew a hard line. And this hard line was going to determine peace or war. And he was very interesting, Anderson. He had sympathy for the South, but he was a diehard Unionist as well. And he said he will fight to the last drop that is left. And so he assembled his men, and they took a vote. There were 12 of his senior men, and the vote was, okay, keep Sumter, risk certain war. And so all of a sudden, this man was going to determine the great question of where the Union stood or didn't stand. And Abner Doubleday of baseball fame, he said, go to war? Yes. And they went down a roll of 12 people, and they all said the same thing. So Anderson, they embarked upon this path. And he became a hero throughout the United States. But it was interesting. He was driving policy as much as anyone in the cabinet with Abraham Lincoln. And it sort of drifted along. And at one point, 3 Confederates rowed their small boat over to talk and negotiate with Anderson. And Anderson made it clear that he wasn't going to give up. He just wasn't going to give up. So they rung up the flag, and they were hungry. They were running out of weapons and all the machinery of war. But
so they're heroes up to the northern papers. They're like the 300.
They loved them. They said this was like the 300 Spartans.
So, where's Lincoln in all this? Why can't he? Well, Lincoln is faced with a choice here. Is he going to hold on to Sumter, or isn't he? Tell us about Seward's role.
Well, Seward was a dapper senator in the cabinet with Lincoln, And he thought he was better than Lincoln and more influential and more significant, and he was the one who should make policy. And in fact, he was carrying on independent policy in which they crafted a policy of mutual respect, in a sense, and
Well, possible compromise.
compromise. No, you said that well the other day.
Well, I mean, Seward is off on his own bat. He's negotiating with Virginia to basically give up Sumter.
And Virginia is the most powerful state in the Union, in a sense, and they're the mother of all states.
So there's Sumter doing his own thing, and how does Lincoln react to that?
Well, Lincoln was he was very unhappy. He was irate as could be, but he didn't fire Sumner. He took a letter of resignation and he put it into a drawer and he just kept it there. And after that, well, Sumner said, "I now have seen the measure of Lincoln, and he is the best of all of us." And he dutifully followed Lincoln after that.
So Lincoln makes a decision to resupply Sumter, to not give it up. He doesn't want to continue this negotiation with the Virginians, and he basically undercuts Sumter. So he decides to resupply Sumter. Does the resupply happen?
The resupply was critical, and any of these kind of involvements made war increasingly likely to happen.
Well, they announced that they're going to do it, but of course, fog of war, the ships never get there.
Well, yeah, this is funny that the ships that were to go to Sumter to resupply, they ended up in Florida. Such is the fog of war.
So all these things are going on. And one thing that strikes me about this, Jay, and I hadn't realized, was how foggy it all was. It was not inevitable that war was going to break out. Lincoln did have some choices. He might have gone along with Seward and worked out a deal that basically said, the South, you can keep your slaves. He said already that the 7 states can keep their slaves, work out some kind of compromise about the territories, maybe allow some slavery in the territories. It wasn't impossible. And if they had done that, they would have saved 700,000 lives.
Yeah, this was a good deal. I mean, imagine this from their point of view. At no point was anyone really asked in the Lincoln cabinet, would you sacrifice 750,000 of our best young men to preserve slavery? And as Evan says, there was a deal to be made, a very powerful deal. And that deal was to allow the slaves to stay where they were in the Western territories, and that was a very small number, allowed them to be in the East, and there they would just wither under, in what we said, 10 years, 20 years?
Well, who knows? I mean, that's the existential dilemma here, is that you could save 700,000 lives, but there'd still be slavery. For how long? Unclear. The other thing, of course, is that when we know in retrospect they lost 700,000 people, but at the time they all thought the war was going to be short. People starting wars always think they're going to be short wars, over by Christmas, on both sides.
Yeah, the Kaiser Wilhelm once said, the troops will be back by the falling leaves of Christmas. And that was what was going on here. But they had a real question to ask. Do they potentially sacrifice this amount of men? Now, what's interesting is if you look at the debates within the cabinet, nowhere do they talk about what the battle casualties would be if war broke out. And had they known, I think Evan's right. They would have been just as likely to
Take the deal.
take the deal.
We should stop here. I want to come back a little bit later, talk a little bit about your career. But before we do that, let's take any questions you might have about this deal that didn't happen, or Lincoln's own somewhat perplexing role. I mean, as Jay said, Lincoln is regarded as a baboon and a hick, at the time. And he's given some great speeches, but he is not the leader we know him to be today. Yes, sir.
So thank you for this book. I have a question about the assessment of the relative strengths of the North and South. In the South, was there a realization that they had fewer people and less industrial might, and that maybe those would be big factors?
Well, I think they were aware of that, but they were fed by these sort of deep and strong passions. And, you know, sometimes leaders, they get dragged into something, and against all logic, they make policies. And arguably, that could be said for the South. However, if you think about it, during Gettysburg, Robert E. Lee looked at a clump of trees. He threw more men at it than any other general had in the past before. And he said, if I can just break that line, if I can just break it right there and I feel it in my bones that it's going to work, they would have won the war. And then we would have had a whole different story altogether.
Oh, the mic. There's a mic here. So
Yeah, there's a mic that you can use. It's right here.
So, can you ask your question first, and then?
Okay, I'll go first. Thank you very much to both of you for being here. My name is Nathan, and I'm a recent graduate of Montgomery College here in the Washington, D.C. area. I'm ultimately hoping to teach history. That's something I've been very passionate about for a long time. My question is, I was reading the chapter about Silas Jackson with great interest, who was, if I'm remembering correctly, an enslaved child near Washington, D.C. And I was wondering...
What I did was I wanted the reader to get a sense of what life was like as a slave, and so I kind of draw that out in great detail.
Yes. I was just wondering if you know what Silas Jackson's life was like later on. When did he become emancipated? What was his life like after emancipation?
Well, the best way for me to answer this is how I close my book, where I say, he was free as a bird.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you very much for illuminating the Crittenden Plan and the Washington Peace Conference that all the other histories I've read kind of gloss over and hardly mention.
And you can just take $25, go to the Willard Hotel,
Yeah.
and go have a nice lunch with one of your friends.
I've taken clients there many times. That peacock rose, pretty impressive.
Right.
But actually, my question is, you know, you go into a lot of detail about how Lincoln kind of caught on, but you seem to have skipped the Cooper Union speech, and I was wondering what your thinking was there.
Do you want to say? It's regarded as one of his great speeches. I mean, so great that the reporters there took pen and paper and just tossed them away.
Right.
And so that sort of mitigated the full extent of what he was talking about. But this is part of the tapestry of Lincoln trying to figure out where he stood. Would he accept slavery? Would he not accept slavery? And, you know, one of his great lines, though, on the abolitionist side, is he said to Alexander Stephens, and Stephens was the vice president. He was a misshapen little man. He was really, really kind of tired looking. But they were friends. And Lincoln said, the nub of this problem, the issue at hand, is that you are for slavery, sir, and I am not.
But Lincoln was at the same time a practical guy. And, you know, I was struck that when he's on his way to Washington, he's saying Civil War is not inevitable. He was willing to tolerate slaves in the South. It was not a done deal. There was conceivably a way out, although you get the sense at the bottom of his soul he was going to let this war happen. It didn't happen in a straight and in considered way with the debates in the cabinet. Wars never start that way. It's always a mistake. But you just get the sense of him that he was going to let this war happen, even though there was a way out, or conceivably a way out.
But if there's one thing I want to implore you to think of, is that Lincoln was not the genius from Mount Olympus at the beginning. As Southerners pointed out, he had never commanded an army. He never was a senator. He never conducted diplomacy. I mean, he was really coming into this great trial very raw and untutored.
And Mr. Thomas, in your introduction, I was struck when you said that
It's a brilliant introduction.
it's a great introduction. But the one thing that bothered me a little was where you said Lincoln had never seen combat, which is technically true, but he and his company buried the dead after 2 skirmishes. So I mean, he knew the consequences of battle.
He had not led in battle. He had seen the consequences of it.
Right.
Hello. Thanks for being here and talking about the book. One question I have is just in the presentation, I haven't read the book, but I think you're talking a lot about what Lincoln wanted. And I'm wondering how you see this in the context of the campaign and his selection as the nominee, because my understanding is he ran saying he was very inflexible on the expansion of slavery to the territories. He just wouldn't accept it. And that was kind of the price of getting the nomination. If people didn't believe him, he wouldn't have got it. And so for him to now turn around and say, well, actually, you can expand into some of the territories, could he really have done that? And is that about his choice, or is that the party? Because I think you mentioned that some of the states seceded right away. And in fact, I think the day after the election, the South Carolina legislature met and they said, that's it. Lincoln's election means the Republican Party is committed to ending slavery. We're out. So they understood that that's what the campaign was about, didn't they?
And Lincoln wasn't even on all the ballots, which is amazing if you think
He wasn't
about
even
it.
on the ballot in the South. Yeah.
Yeah, all across the South, he was nowhere to be found.
I think it's literally true that the platform was no slavery in the territories. True, but there wasn't going to be much slavery in the territories because New Mexico is not a place where you need the economy would support a lot of slaves.
Right.
And the issue is, can we avoid a war here? Lincoln's a practical guy. At the end of the day, he did not avoid the war, but there was, at least from reading your book, the chance that he could have.
Right.
Jay, let me ask you a little bit about your career here because, one reason why we're all here is we're on the eve of possibly another war against Iran. Right now we have a president who is apparently deciding whether to join that war, I guess is the best way of putting it, or not, to throw in.
Or charitably putting it.
So, you've spent so long studying how presidents do this. What do we learn? What do we learn from the past about what Trump is facing right now?
Well, that wars start one way, and they have an own internal logic of their own, and things get out of hand, and one can never take it with a blitheness of spirit. And war is inherently, it's a very dangerous enterprise. And it involves men, it involves morals, morality. And I just think that in today's environment, I mean, the parallels are really remarkable. A country coming apart, a country divided, a country at war with itself in some ways. And that's taken right out of the script of The Lost Peace.
You've written about a lot of presidents, FDR, Lincoln. Do you think that I'm interested in this is the very beginning of the Lincoln story. You've written about the end of the Lincoln story. How do you think that Lincoln grew during the course of the war? How did that change him, and how did he grow?
I think he really did grow. He started out as a untutored political figure who was very charming, but he had a lot to learn. But he learned it. He became his own man in the end, and he really, when we look at Lincoln now, I mean, this man was truly a great president, and I think it's safe to say he was the most important president in American history, save for perhaps George Washington. And then the other thing that I've seen is things start out one way and then they go in an entirely different direction. I've written about FDR. I've written about the founders. I've written about Lincoln. And I also, on 9/11, I'll sort of throw out a kind of shameless promotion here. On 9/11, when the world was kind of worried about what would happen next, George Bush came out of Marine One and South Lawn of the White House, and he was carrying a book. And his book was My April 1865. So one of the things I guess I would say is presidents can learn from history, and they need to learn from history.
Did Bush ask you about the book? Did you meet with Bush? Did you talk to him?
Yeah, I mean, he sent me a note and he said, I'd like to get together. And I was at a dinner at the White House, and I said, Mr. President, I'd like to meet and talk with you sometime. And then all of a sudden, boom, out of nowhere, an aide came. He took out a card and said, George Bush. And he said, I hope you call us. And so I went home that night, and I wondered, okay, what do you do when the president? And so what I did was I called the next day, and they said, we've been waiting for your call. And then he and I had lunch in the private Oval Office. There's the Oval Office we know, but there's also a little mess. And I decided I'd have whatever he was going to have, I was going to have. I was going to be very political about this. And so he got a turkey sandwich with one thin slice of turkey. And so I was very hungry that day. But he was great with my kids. And, I mean, they just got along famously. And he looked over to my son Nathaniel and my son Evan, and he said, it's pretty cool, isn't it, huh? And so Josh Bolton, the chief of staff, took the boys to lunch. And so Hank Paulson, the head of the Treasury, was at one table, and they were at a different table eating ice cream, presidential ice cream. And then from there, Bush would have me come into the White House, and we would talk about history. And he was very interesting. He wanted to be underestimated because he thought he got more by doing that. He said, I have Henry Kissinger come to the White House all the time because I want Henry to go to his famous friends and talk about how great George Bush is. But it's been an eye-opener to have spent all that time with Bush. He's a good tennis player too.
Jay was good. Jay was on the Yale tennis team, so I'm sure you got points with Bush for that.
But he said he didn't want to be known as a snob, so he gave up playing tennis.
Do you think he learned from history?
I think he knew. He read a history book every week. He was an avid reader, and with Karl Rove, they sort of kept a running contest as to who read more. And he said to me one day, which I thought was simple but insightful in its own right. And he said, why are Grant's memoirs held with such regard as they are? And they are considered one of the greatest of presidential memoirs. And is it because we say they are, or he really was that great? He had a good sense of humor.
Yeah.
I'm trying to get into Lincoln's head when he's on the train coming to Baltimore and from Baltimore to DC. Did he have a plan, or I'm looking at one of your comments here where it says that he did not see himself as the great emancipator, nor did he believe the country was on the brink of a civil war. Did he leave Illinois and come here with a plan or a set of expectations, or was he taken by surprise a little bit when he got to the Willard Hotel? What was in his mind at
Did
that?
Lincoln have a plan is the question as he headed towards Washington?
I think he had his plan. And his plan was that war was not inevitable, but he could also stop the march of slavery. And it didn't seem as daunting to him as it is to us with hindsight, showing just what a difficult struggle that was.
I think he didn't really know. Yeah.
So my question is, why was Lincoln so against secession? I mean, I've always wondered this, like, why not let them succeed? I mean, in one sense, it would almost be like this compromise that some people were talking about. States that want to have slavery succeed and they become their own country. And from my understanding, it's not like the Constitution forbade secession. So I've never understood why not just let that happen as a way, perhaps, to avoid war and as a way for like two parts of the country, two regions, to just go in their own directions. Like, why was he so adamant against that? And did anybody ever discuss that as a possible solution?
I think that's a great question. And I think what we can say is that the one thing that Lincoln, we know, really felt hard in his bones was that the Union should stay intact. He did not want the Union broken up. And I'm not sure he would have gone to war to save slavery if that question were put to the American people. But I think for sure he would not have allowed the Union to break up. That was something he felt more deeply than anything else he felt.
We're gonna end a little bit early. Jay, a couple of years ago, got Parkinson's. So this is his last book. And I want us all to give a hand to Jay Winik.